Okay guys, welcome to our first theory presentation. My name is Rachel Thompson. I'll be discussing psychoanalysis, which is the first psychological theory. It's by Sigmund Freud. It was developed around the turn of the 19th century, and I'll be discussing lots of different key ideas by Freud and his view on the personality and his view on development. And I'll be discussing what psychoanalytic therapy really looks like and what a client could get out of it or would potentially want to get out of it. So bear with me. I'm sorry if I kind of yell at the beginning of some of the slides, but I think I articulated most of the key ideas that we're looking for here, and I'm going to try to help you understand what psychoanalysis is, so bear with me. So since Freud and psychoanalysis is the first theory that we're talking about in this class, there isn't really a theory before it or something that it's based off of. He was kind of groundbreaking, honestly. So I wanted to talk about some interesting history of psychology before we get into more about him. In ancient Greece, Greeks identified mental illness as an actual medical condition. They tried to understand it as best they could, but of course they were limited. But they understood that soothing words and encouraging people with mental illnesses was actually helpful for them. Later on, psychotherapy was sometimes used for treatment of the insane, but it really wasn't until Wilhelm Wundt that modern psychology was kind of formed. He was the first person to call himself a psychologist. He opened the first psychology institute, and he did a lot of work with the conscious mind, and he treated the mind like an objective item that can be understood and studied. And then Freud came along and said, well, the unconscious is even bigger, and he developed psychoanalysis. Alright, so I want to discuss the world setting and what Freud experienced in the world that he worked in and he lived in. The most interesting thing I discovered about his setting and the setting around this turn of the century time that might have influenced Freud's work was actually in Vienna itself. In Vienna, during the second half of the 19th century, the professional middle class had an intense moral preoccupation with sexuality, particularly in women and children. During this time, sexuality was not only a personal and familial concern, but a political and social one as well. This was because information about STDs was more well known, and people had decided that there were moral consequences for acts of homosexuality, masturbation, and other sexual deeds, I guess. During this time, medical researchers were also focusing more specifically on sexuality. This cultural obsession could have influenced Freud's work. It also goes to show that Freud isn't as out of line as we might think nowadays during this time. This is common to discuss sex, maybe not in a psychology setting, but in general, sex was very prevalent in their society. Okay, so who was Sigmund Freud? It's a pretty huge question, but I'm going to just start with some basic biography information. He was born in 1856 in a Viennese family. He's the oldest of 8 children. There are 3 boys and 5 girls, so a really big family, which means they, of course, did have limited finances, but it specifically says that he was really never without things that he wanted or desired. He was always encouraged to pursue a higher education and more, and academically challenge himself and just grow into the best scholar he could be. It's important to note, though, too, that he did have an authoritarian father. This is important later when he analyzes himself and starts to develop psychoanalysis because he draws upon that experience with his father just to provide evidence for a few things. We'll discuss that more later. But he actually didn't have a psychology or philosophy degree like a lot of other people. He actually had a career in medicine. He earned his medical degree at 26 from the University of Vienna, and he actually became a lecturer there later on in his career. Continuing on with some background information about Freud, he spent much of his life developing the theory of psychoanalysis in Vienna, Austria. Later, as he was near the end of his life, he had to flee because of Nazi control of Austria, and the Nazis actually let him leave because of his popularity, and they knew it would probably draw attention if he was hurt or taken. He was actually, well, okay, I guess I should say he was Jewish. That's pretty important. So he actually fled to America, but most of his life was spent in Austria. He used self-analysis to really begin developing psychoanalysis. He had numerous psychosomatic disorders and phobias and exaggerated fears of dying. So to try to discover and uncover why he had those, he actually studied his dreams, his memories, and experiences to try to uncover his unconscious, basically. A lot of people understand his thoughts on the unconscious can be considered part of the anti-German idealism movement. Him and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer all kind of thought that there is more to us than what we're aware of, basically. You'll hear me say basically things like that a lot, that there is more to us than what we're aware of in our conscious personality. Freud has a big emphasis on the unconscious, and that's basically the basic idea behind psychoanalysis. The goal of psychoanalytic therapy is to make the unconscious motives conscious, for only then can an individual exercise choice. The best way I think of to understand all of this is that Freud wanted to help himself and his clients and everyone else understand why they are the way they are, what experiences, what trauma, what development made us the way we are and made our personality form and our unconscious form the way it did, so that we can be free of that bias and that influence to make our own choices outside of that, outside of our past experiences. So the big ideas we're going to discuss is the structure of personality, consciousness and the unconsciousness, anxiety, ego defense mechanisms, and personality development later on. Bear with me, this is going to be a lot of information. So let's get started by talking about the structure of personality. In the psychoanalytic view, three systems together make up the personality: the id, the superego, and the ego. Don't think of these as independent systems. They have to operate all together to make the personality function as one. They cannot operate on their own. It's important to understand too that humans are seen as energy systems, and there's a limited amount of psychic energy. Therefore, if one system gets empowered, it'll gain control over the other two. I've attached this graphic, I guess, to help understand Freud himself considered conscious and our mind and the unconscious kind of just like an iceberg, saying what you can see and understand and what you're aware of is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more to it. So this shows you that the id is completely unconscious, but the ego and the superego have experiences outside of, like, around their environment, basically. Okay, so what is the id? I have attached this GIF to kind of help us understand as we go through the three different systems of personality, and each cronk in this setting, the main cronk, the angel cronk, and the devil cronk, is represented by one of the structures of personality, and we'll talk about that as we go on. But we're going to start with the little devil on Kronk's shoulder. That's representative of the id. So the id is our original system of personality. At birth, we are only comprised of id. It's ruled by the pleasure principle. It's illogical and amoral, and it only focuses on instant gratification. It basically houses our unconscious instincts and impulses. It only wishes and acts. So it doesn't, it's really, a devil kind of makes it sound like it's a naturally bad thing. It's not. Like, we all have these inherent impulses, but The id doesn't logically decide, oh, is this a good choice? It doesn't morally decide, is this going to help me? It just is id. So that is completely unconscious impulses that are inside of us. Okay, continuing on with the different structure of personality systems, and comparing them to our gift. So we just talked about the little devil, which is the unconscious id. And now we're going to talk about little angel Kronk. Angel Kronk represents the superego. The superego is the judicial branch of our personality. It includes a person's moral code, and it's concerned if an action is good or bad, and if it is right or wrong. It functions to inhibit the id's impulses and to persuade the ego to substitute moralistic goals for realistic ones. So it's trying to reach the rewards of self-love and pride, and it always wants to strive to do the best thing. But sometimes if we fail to always do the morally correct thing, I guess, it leads to feelings of just us not feeling adequate and us striving for perfection we're never going to have. So it has negative consequences as well. It's not always angelic. Okay, so the last person in this gift that we haven't talked about yet is Kronk himself. That arrow is telling you that Kronk in this image is the ego. The ego is actually the executive that governs and controls and regulates our personalities. Kronk in this picture is mediating between his superego and his id. He's trying to make logical and realistic choices by considering his natural impulses that are always tempting him, and his information about morals, and his information that he already has formed about good and bad, and he wants to make good decisions, obviously. The ego also mediates between our instincts and our surrounding environment that it has access to. The ego is also responsible for controlling the blind impulses of the id, which doesn't have access to our natural environment. So all of these together form our personality, and it's very critical to understand his thinking about the personality, to understand later on the unconscious and how to pull that out of someone. So that leads perfectly into discussing consciousness and what the unconscious is. So here is my quote again. We're trying to make unconscious motives conscious for our clients so that they can start to understand what true freedom is and what a true choice is without being influenced by their unconsciousness that they don't understand. The unconscious stores all of our experiences and our memories and our repressed material. So it's our job as counselors and analysts to start understanding someone's unconscious. We can do this by studying their dreams. Dreams are symbolic representations of unconscious needs, wishes, and conflicts. We can view their Freudian slips, which are slips of the tongue, their post-hypnotic suggestions, material derived from free association techniques, and symbolic content of psychotic symptoms. We can start to really view those as access to their unconscious, because we can't just talk to them about it and then talk from that experience. The only way we can view that is studying little things about them and try to form those ideas. Another way to start to really understand your client and their unconscious better is to understand the idea of anxiety by Freud in this situation. Anxiety is defined by him as a feeling of dread that results from repressed feelings, memories, desires, and experiences that emerge to the surface of awareness. Anxiety develops from conflicts among the id, ego, and superego over control of the available psychic energy. There's 3 different kinds of anxiety. There's reality anxiety, which is fear of danger from the external world. Neurotic anxiety, which is fear that the instincts will cause the person to do something they'll be punished for. And there's moral anxiety, which is fear of one's own conscience. So all of those, again, the way that a person displays or feels anxiety is another way to try to understand their unconscious to begin to help them change their character and change their habits. Ego defense mechanisms are another way to begin to see from our client's point of view and to understand what their unconscious is like and what it's been shaped by. So ego defense mechanisms help an individual cope with their anxiety and prevent their ego from being overwhelmed. All ego defense mechanisms have two characteristics in common. They either deny or distort reality, and they all operate on an unconscious level. So this list of ego defense mechanisms are just some examples, but all of these, they have signs, they have clear reasons why a person might be doing these, and it's important to study these and keep these in mind when going over someone's unconscious, because you need to understand what they are trying to hide and what they are trying to bury deeper so that you can free their unconscious and really free them and help them be able to make more unbiased choices. Okay, let's discuss the development of personality by Freud. This is something you probably are very familiar with if you have taken child psychology or if you were in education major. This is something you probably had to talk about. It's something he's very famous for. It's the psychosexual things that everybody thinks that Freud is obsessed with sex because of these. But it's important because the first 6 years of life are the foundation on which the personality is built. If a child's needs aren't met during these stages, they can become fixated and have psychological problems relating to that stage later on in life. The stages are the oral stage, which deals with the inability to trust oneself and others, resulting in the fear of loving and forming close relationships and low self-esteem. Anal stage deals with the inability to recognize and express anger, resulting in the denial of one's own power as a person and the lack of a sense of autonomy. And the phallic stage deals with the inability to fully accept one's sexuality and sexual feelings, or even accepting oneself as a man or a woman at all. If you're interested in talking more about the psychosexual stages or reading more about that, I encourage you to look at your book. But for time's sake, we are going to move on and not go much more into detail there, because it's really time to talk about what psychoanalytic therapy really looks like. The ultimate goal of psychoanalytic treatment is to increase the adaptive functioning, which involves the reduction of symptoms and the resolution of conflicts. The two goals to try to achieve that ultimate goal are to make the unconscious conscious, which is what I focused on for most of understanding his thoughts about everything, honestly. And then the second goal is to strengthen our ego so that behavior is based more on reality and less on our instinctual cravings, which is the id, or irrational guilt, which is kind of what the superego imposes on us if we don't live up to its moral standard. Successful analysis would result in a significant modification of the individual's personality and character structure. So that would be how a psychoanalyst would measure change in someone. So what does psychoanalytic therapy look like? The analyst in this situation will take a blank screen approach. That means they're going to be anonymous and they're not going to be judgmental. They're not going to form a relationship or a bond, and they're not going to self-disclose to make the person feel more comfortable. They're going to actually have a sense of neutrality throughout their relationship. This is in the hopes of building a transference relationship. That goal is for the client to project their feelings onto their anonymous analyst These projections are originating from unsettled past experiences, and they're key to understanding the client's unconscious too, just like all the other things we've discussed that are important for that. The analyst is going to listen to their client in a respectful and open-minded way, and they're only going to interrupt when necessary. And the analyst is going to pay attention to what is said and really what isn't said too, and they're going to listen for gaps and associations between the two because they're looking for any keys they can try to understand their unconscious, the unconscious of their clients with. That's the entire point of everything. That's what we're aiming towards, is making the conscious conscious and strengthening that person's ego and confidence in themselves so that they can make better choices later. Continuing on with what this therapy can look like, in the classical form of psychoanalytic therapy, the client and the analyst make a long commitment to work through this therapy process together. The client might engage in free association, where they're going to attempt to say whatever's on their mind without a filter. And then the analyst has to accept whatever they're saying with no judgment in order for the client to comfortably work through old habits while in therapy. So the clients might gain insights into the workings of their unconscious processes, and the clients are going to come to understand their associations between the past experiences they have and their current behavior. So basically understanding the effect their unconscious has on their consciousness, I guess. The client can only be capable of changing and developing their character and themselves once they understand this relationship. So that's what it's all about. We are trying to help the client promote change in their life by helping them understand their unconscious and their development of their personality, and help them be truly free to change and develop and grow outside of that past experience. So after all of that, what can we decide that Freud contributed to the world? Well, honestly, Freud was groundbreaking. Love him or hate him, he just was groundbreaking, and he knew it. He he changed therapy from just being talking about our feelings and giving advice to our issues to actually trying to understand why people act the way they act and what psychodynamic factors affect our behavior. And he called attention to the role of the unconscious, and he said, you know what? People have past experiences and past traumas and all these different things that can make us hurt and suffer, and that really affects us. That affects our decision-making abilities. That affects our personality, and everything can be traced back to our development, really. But he wanted to change that. He wanted to help people understand that so that they can be free from their past experiences and their past traumas to make their own choices. He developed the first therapeutic procedures for modifying and understanding a client's character. And his psychoanalysis is the core idea behind many future therapeutic approaches. So everything we're going to be talking about from here on out can be kind of traced back to him, and that's pretty sweet. All right, time to start wrapping things up, guys. So I have some reflection questions for you. It's pretty important that we understand ourselves pretty well. We've heard that from a lot of the faculty now, that before we can really start counseling other people, we have to have a good understanding of ourselves so that we're never in the situation where our experience with them and talking about their experience brings us pain because of something that's unresolved. So if you participated in psychoanalytic therapy, what would you learn about yourself, and how would you use that information to help promote change in your life and just grow overall as an individual? And what type of client do you think this therapy could most benefit? I hated psychoanalysis when I first started reading about it and studying it, but honestly, I do think there's certain clientele that this could really help. Maybe, actually, I'm not going to tell you what I think. I want you to decide for yourself, but I have thought about it and I encourage you to do the same. Thanks for listening to my presentation. See you guys next week.